Get your hands off that piece of garbage before I call security to have you handcuffed." Julian Sterling's voice cut through the manicured quiet of the VIP arrival circle at the Whispering Pines Golf and Country Club, sharp and absolute, causing several members on the veranda to pause mid-conversation. A tall, heavily built man, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt and dark sweatpants, stood beside a dusty navy blue Ford Expedition, unhooking a weathered mountain bike from the rear rack. The cold morning breeze off the Savannah River rustled the leaves of the ancient live oaks, carrying the faint, bitter scent of fresh fertilizer and expensive tobacco across the asphalt. He did not flinch or turn around immediately, choosing instead to secure the heavy chain lock around the bike frame with slow, deliberate movements. When he finally turned to face the source of the shout, his expression was entirely unreadable, and his voice carried a low, heavy resonance that forced the nearby valet staff to lean in closer to catch the words. "This is my vehicle," LeBron James said. His large hands remained open, palms facing outward, a natural posture of restraint that he had practiced for more than half his life. Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound that rattled against the limestone pillars of the clubhouse entrance. "Right, because a man dressed like you just casually rolls into a private estate with a half-shredded bicycle on the back of an old truck." He turned his torso toward the upper terrace, toward the cluster of wealthy members holding condensation-chilled glasses of Sauvignon Blanc, deliberately elevating his tone so it would cut through the morning air. "We have a vagrant trying to breach the secure parking zone. Someone get security down here right now." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence grew heavy, pressing against the ears of the onlookers as the morning sun began to bake the gravel driveway. The young valet attendant froze mid-stride, a pair of keys dangling from his index finger, his eyes darting between the immaculate leather loafers of the director and the worn sneakers of the giant standing by the truck. And LeBron James, 41 years old, stood perfectly still with his large hands exposed and resting loosely on the handlebars, waiting because he had stood in some version of this exact clearing before, and he knew that the next few minutes were going to cost someone their entire career, and he was absolutely certain it would not be him. What Julian Sterling did not know, what he could not have possibly deduced from the faded cotton hoodie, the 3 days of thick stubble, and the heavy, unassuming way the man carried his massive frame, was that he had just threatened to arrest the man who personally authorized his employment. There is a specific kind of arrogance that operates entirely independent of facts. It relies on a prehistoric instinct that evaluates a person in less than a second, measuring the texture of their clothes, the color of their skin, and the posture of their spine, before delivering an unshakable verdict that it will spend the rest of the day aggressively defending. Julian Sterling possessed that exact brand of certainty, a confidence built on years of managing elite properties where wealthy men paid fortunes to never have to look at the realities of the outside world. He viewed himself not as an aggressor, but as a dedicated gatekeeper protecting the sanctity of a fragile paradise from the intrusion of those who did not belong. Hold on to that image. It becomes heavy later. But before we look at the wreckage of how this morning ended, we must slow the clock down by a few hours to see who the man with the scratched bicycle actually was, because almost no one at Whispering Pines had a single clue, and that was precisely the way he had designed it. The morning crowd on the veranda began to lean over the wrought iron railing, their faces a collective mask of mild amusement and cold detachment. A wealthy developer in a tailored polo shirt whispered something to his companion, causing her to chuckle softly while keeping her eyes locked onto the driveway below. They watched the scene unfold with the passive interest of theatergoers, waiting for an unpleasant nuisance to be quietly swept away by the authorities. But nobody in that driveway understood what was actually engraved on the underside of that faded metal bike frame yet. LeBron James had started his day at 5 in the morning inside a modest, two-bedroom brick house on the working-class side of Savannah, miles away from the iron gates and Spanish moss of the country club. There were no assistants clearing his path, no security details idling in black SUVs at the curb, and no chefs preparing meticulously balanced macronutrient meals in a stainless steel kitchen. He had driven into the city alone 2 days prior, intentionally leaving the heavy machinery of his global brand behind in Los Angeles, because his spirit required the kind of silence that cannot be purchased in a luxury penthouse. The house belonged to an old high school teammate's grandmother, a woman who still kept a plastic runner over her living room carpet, and whose walls were lined with faded photographs of children who had moved away to look for work. He moved through the small kitchen with a quiet, careful grace that seemed almost impossible for a man of his immense size and physical power. He boiled water in an old tin kettle that whistled with a low, raspy rattle, pouring it over cheap coffee grounds into a ceramic mug that had a chipped handle and a faded logo of a local high school football team. He sat on the small wooden porch in the gray morning light, watching the neighborhood wake up as the local factory workers warmed up their old sedans and delivery trucks began their early rounds. This small ritual was his anchor, a deliberate discipline he maintained whether he was staying in a $10,000 a night villa in Capri or a forgotten neighborhood in Georgia. He spent exactly 5 minutes looking at the cracked pavement, the overgrown weeds cutting through the concrete, and the gray mist rising off the distant marshland before the world could fill his head with schedules, contracts, and expectations. He was a man of unfathomable wealth, a billionaire whose financial decisions could shift the economic landscape of entire cities. Yet he worked with an almost religious intensity to ensure that the wealth did not erode his skin. He had learned in his early 20s that the moment people see the ledger of your bank account, they immediately stop interacting with your humanity and begin negotiating with your numbers. He had made a conscious choice in his 30s that he would always prefer to be underestimated by strangers than to be misunderstood by those who only valued his gravity. So, he wore old gray fleece hoodies until the seams began to fray at the wrists, drove a 10-year-old utility vehicle with a dented quarter panel when he wanted to move through a city unseen, and gave millions away through channels that explicitly forbade the use of his legal name. The giving was the actual spine of his existence, the only part of his vast empire that he guarded with absolute secrecy and discussed with no one outside his immediate family. The scratched mountain bike resting on the back of his truck was his single non-negotiable attachment to the dirt he had come from, a piece of machinery he carried with him across the country like a talisman. He had purchased it because when he was a boy growing up in Akron, moving from one condemned apartment to another every 6 months, a local youth coach had given him a bicycle so he could make it to basketball practice on time without having to walk through the dangerous winter streets alone. He had never forgotten the cold metal of those handlebars, the rhythmic click of the chain, or the sudden immense feeling of absolute freedom that came from realizing he could outrun the poverty of his block if he just pedaled hard enough. He kept this current bike not for exercise, but to remind the billionaire in the mirror of the 10-year-old boy who used to hide his transportation in the bushes so the older kids wouldn't take it from him. His mother had taught him the physics of survival in those cold apartments without ever realizing she was delivering a masterclass in emotional warfare, simply by refusing to let the world break her spirit. She was a small woman with a voice that could command a room but hands that were permanently calloused from working 2 retail jobs at once. And LeBron had spent his childhood watching how the city's bureaucracy spoke down to her. He watched landlords, grocery store managers, and city clerks speak to her with a slow, patronizing loudness, as if a mother living on food stamps could not possibly comprehend the terms of a lease or the fine print on a utility bill. He watched her absorb that cold condescension week after week, her jaw tightening into a hard, perfect line while her voice remained low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. She had understood an equation that LeBron would spend the next 3 decades cementing into his own bones as he climbed into rooms where he was often the only person who looked like him. A man of his size and color does not get to show anger the way other men show anger in America. The exact same raised voice that reads as righteous passion in a white corporate executive reads as an imminent physical threat in a man who stands 6 feet 9 inches tall. The same firm, unyielding word that makes an elite athlete respected makes a young black man from the inner city an institutional problem. His mother had known that math in her marrow, and she had built a fortress of dignity out of refusing to give the people in authority the explosive reaction they were desperately waiting for. "Stay small in your voice, LeBron," she used to tell him as they walked home past the flashing blue lights of police cruisers. "Not because they deserve your politeness, but because your silence is a wall they can never find a crack to crawl through." He had carried that quiet armor into boardrooms, where hundreds of millions of dollars were traded like loose change, turning stillness into his most lethal weapon. He did not yell. When television commentators questioned his character, he did not shout when corporate partners tried to alter the terms of a deal at the last minute, and he did not react when wealthy club directors looked straight through him as if he were part of the furniture. He had discovered that a silence held long enough and with enough physical stillness developed a gravity of its own, forcing the loudest people in the room to eventually exhaust themselves against his quiet. It had kept him whole through 20 years of intense public scrutiny, and it was about to protect him again in a gravel driveway in front of 40 wealthy onlookers and 2 responding police officers. Though as he stood there, under the burning morning sun, the weight of the silence felt like trying to breathe with a chest full of sand. The world at Whispering Pines did not know that 24 months prior to this humid morning, an obscure private equity vehicle named Summit Ridge Capital had quietly completed the purchase of the entire resort estate. The historic club, which had operated on the banks of the river for nearly a century, had been less than 90 days from total financial insolvency after a series of bad investments by the old board of trustees. The impending bankruptcy would have resulted in the immediate termination of more than 60 local staff members, many of whom were groundkeepers, kitchen workers, and laundry staff who had spent 30 years maintaining the property. Summit Ridge had stepped into the dark, stabilized the crushing debt, and inserted a permanent legal covenant into the purchase agreement that explicitly protected every single employee from arbitrary layoffs. The wealthy members of the club were notified only that a new corporate entity had assumed ownership and that their annual membership fees would remain unchanged for the foreseeable future. They were never given a name, a face, or a specific corporate identity to associate with the rescue package because the founder of Summit Ridge Capital did not care for corporate vanity. The man who controlled 80% of that fund, who sat at the head of its executive board, and who had personally threatened to walk away from the deal if the older employees were not legally protected, was LeBron James. He had driven his old truck to the property on this specific morning for a very precise reason, and it had absolutely nothing to do with playing a round of golf on a pristine course. A handwritten letter had reached him 3 weeks ago through his charitable foundation in Ohio, written by someone who refused to sign their name out of an obvious and pervasive fear of professional retaliation. The letter claimed that the new day-to-day management team at Whispering Pines had begun systematically violating labor protections settled in the acquisition agreement by fabricating performance write-ups. They were targeting the older local staff members, assigning them impossible workloads and writing them up for microscopic infractions like arriving 3 minutes late or leaving a tool out in the rain. The goal was to force these long-serving workers to resign under pressure, so the club could replace them with younger, seasonal hospitality workers who would accept lower wages and no healthcare benefits. LeBron did not notify his compliance officers or send an official corporate auditor down to Georgia to conduct an announced investigation, because he knew that corporate audits only revealed what executives wanted people to see. He had learned a long time ago that you can never truly understand the moral architecture of an institution by reading a color-coded spreadsheet in a high-rise office building. You had to walk into the machinery looking like absolutely nobody, strip away the protective shield of your celebrity, and watch how the people in authority treat a person they assume has no power to fight back. So, he had pulled his oldest gray fleece hoodie out of his travel bag, thrown his childhood talisman onto the back of his faded truck, and driven into the secret heart of his own investment to see if his promises were being kept. He had spent the previous 45 minutes inside the public spaces of the clubhouse, and what he observed had troubled his spirit far more than it had reassured him. He had ordered a plain black coffee at the side counter and sat near the windows, watching how a wealthy young member spoke to the teenage busboy who had accidentally spilled water on a leather chair. He watched how the club's floor manager watched the interaction, standing with his arms crossed, completely ignoring the member's harsh language while giving the young worker a cold, warning look that signaled his job was on the line. Courtesy inside an elite establishment always flowed downward along the path of economic vulnerability, and LeBron could see that the lower levels of the chain were beginning to rot from a lack of basic human respect. He had filed those observations away in his mind, paid for his coffee with a crumpled $10 bill, left a $50 cash tip that would make the young barista stare in absolute disbelief for the rest of her shift, and walked out toward the parking circle. He had intended to take his mountain bike down to the river trail to clear his head and think about the corporate restructurings he would need to enforce before the weekend arrived. But the thinking never happened in the way he had planned, because the reality of the club's culture met him on the asphalt in the form of Julian Sterling's righteous shout. The Whispering Pines Golf and Country Club sat on a low limestone bluff overlooking the brown, swirling waters of the Savannah River, its architecture a sprawling mass of whitewashed brick, wide-covered porches, and towering glass windows angled to catch the southern sun. The membership here cost more per year than an average family in Savannah made in a decade, and the waiting list was controlled by an admissions committee that valued family lineage far more than the size of a man's bank account. The air around the main terrace smelled of citronella candles, expensive sunblock, and grilled salmon from the outdoor kitchen. Below the main driveway, the maintenance shed smelled of diesel fuel, cut grass, and sun-baked timber. And that was where an elderly groundkeeper named Elijah Vance was organizing a row of rusty weed whackers when the dusty Ford Expedition rolled onto the property. Elijah Vance was 67 years old and had maintained the turf, the sand traps, and the perimeter fences at Whispering Pines for more than 34 years under 4 different corporate management regimes. He had a severe limp in his left knee from an old labor injury, a set of calloused hands that could rebuild a commercial lawnmower engine in the dark, and a 12-year-old granddaughter named Maya, whose school honor roll certificates were neatly taped to the inside of his metal locker. Elijah had been one of the 62 local workers who would have lost their entire livelihood 2 years ago when the old board nearly ran the club into the dirt. And he was one of the few who understood that some nameless corporate entity had stepped into the courtroom at the last second to save his retirement. He did not know the legal mechanics of the deal, but he possessed a memory for details that had never failed him in his 6 decades of life on the coast. He had been working near the front gates 2 years prior, on the one afternoon when the primary investor of Summit Ridge Capital had come down to inspect the acreage before signing the final papers. He had shaken that investor's massive hand, a hand that completely engulfed his own, and he had looked into a face that he recognized from every television screen in the country. So, when the dusty truck parked in the VIP circle and the giant in the gray hoodie stepped out, Elijah Vance went completely rigid with a grease rag frozen in his right hand, because he knew exactly who had just arrived at the club. He also understood, with the sharp survival instinct of an old black man who had lived his entire life in the Deep South, that the giant was dressed specifically to pass through the world without a name. Elijah had spent his life around people who wanted to be invisible for one reason or another, and he knew how to grant a man that particular courtesy when it was needed. He looked back down at the engine cowling of the lawnmower, kept his mouth shut, and allowed LeBron James to be a nobody for exactly 9 minutes before the peace of the morning shattered. Julian Sterling was 51 years old, and as the executive director of Whispering Pines, he viewed his position not as a job, but as an absolute social mission to maintain the standards of the estate. He had no idea that his payroll was processed through a subsidiary company owned by Summit Ridge Capital, meaning he was, in the most literal sense of the law, an employee of the man standing by the bicycle. Julian had spent 9 years deciding which corporate applications were approved, which local families were granted access to the dining room, and which visitors were met with a cold, silent stare from the front gate guard. He did not consider himself a cruel man. He considered himself a necessary filter. When he looked across the driveway and saw a large black man in an unbranded gray sweatshirt handling a scratch bicycle next to an old truck, his mind bypassed every logical question and arrived instantly at a verdict. That man does not belong to this ground. And everything Julian did next, he did with the profound, dangerous conviction of an executive who believes he is performing a vital civic duty for his community. This is the most resilient kind of prejudice that exists in the world, the kind that does not use slurs or carry signs, but instead dresses itself in the language of security, protocol, and institutional protection. He had been crossing the gravel path toward the veranda when he saw LeBron reach for the bike chain. And instead of assuming that a man with a key to a lock is the rightful owner of the property, Julian's certainty supplied a criminal narrative. "I've been the executive director here for nearly a decade," Julian said, his voice rising into a theatrical pitch that commanded the attention of every member sitting on the upper terrace. "I know every face that has a right to park in this circle, and I have never seen you in my life. And people who belong at Whispering Pines do not show up looking like they spent the night in a homeless shelter." He pulled an iPhone from his linen blazer pocket, his fingers moving across the glass screen with a practiced, aggressive speed. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave that equipment where it is and walk off this private property before things become incredibly difficult for you." "I'm not going to walk away from my own vehicle, officer," LeBron said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming so perfectly flat and quiet that it seemed to pull the heat right out of the air. Julian did not answer him. He simply pressed the dial button and held the phone to his ear, while keeping his eyes locked onto LeBron's chest. The call he made would matter immensely within the hour, its exact wording recorded by a county dispatcher and destined to be played back in a small room where the air conditioning did not work. He told the emergency operator that a large, aggressive male had breached the secure VIP circle at the private country club and was actively attempting to dismantle property. He stated that the individual was non-compliant, that the situation was escalating, and that the clubhouse staff felt completely unsafe remaining on the veranda. LeBron did not move a muscle, his large hands resting openly on the rubber grips of his handlebars, absorbing the weight of the phone call with the heavy, patient stillness of a mountain during a storm. Up on the high wooden terrace, a group of teenage children belonging to the club's members had drifted away from the brunch tables to lean over the white railing. One of them, a 14-year-old girl with a silver camera phone, had already begun recording the scene because her generation possessed an innate, almost terrifying instinct for recognizing the exact moment an ordinary morning was about to turn into an administrative execution. LeBron looked up once, his dark eyes catching the glint of the camera lens in the sunlight, but he did not wave his hand or cover his face. He simply stood beside his old truck, the bicycle tires resting on the clean gravel, and waited for the local police department to arrive and settle the question of who had a right to stand on the earth. Two local police cruisers rolled through the brick archways of the Whispering Pines entrance. Exactly 8 minutes later, their roof lights pulsing silently in red and blue against the white brick facade of the main building. The crunch of their heavy tires on the gravel driveway was the loudest sound in the circle, causing several waiters to stop mid-service and stand perfectly still with silver trays balanced on their palms. The first officer to step out of the lead vehicle was a man named Garrett Hobbs, a veteran supervisor with a thick chest, a short-cropped military haircut, and the particular, rigid posture of a man who had already constructed his version of the truth before his boots hit the ground. His right hand remained lowered, resting naturally near the retention strap of his holstered service weapon, a physical sentence that required no translation for anyone watching from the porch. He walked directly past Julian Sterling, completely ignoring the valet stand and the club's staff, and stepped into the small space separating his cruiser from the navy blue Ford Expedition. In the legal grammar that Officer Hobbs carried in his head, there was only one individual in this driveway who required immediate tactical focus. The second officer, a younger woman named Rachel Miller, moved with a much slower, more deliberate rhythm, doing the thing that exceptional law enforcement officers do and mediocre ones never manage, which was to look at the entire landscape before stepping into the line of sight. She took in the absolute stillness of the tall man by the bicycle, noted his open, visible hands, and then observed the eager, triumphant stride of Julian Sterling as he moved in to join the perimeter. "Sir, step away from that equipment right now and place your hands on the hood of the truck," Officer Hobbs said, his voice carrying the flat, metallic weight of an order that could not be negotiated. "Can I ask what the nature of the complaint is, officer?" LeBron asked, taking one slow step back from the bicycle frame while keeping his empty hands raised to the level of his shoulders, his voice completely level and devoid of any defensive heat. "We received an emergency report of an active vehicle property theft and a non-compliant suspect," Hobbs said, his eyes scanning the frayed edges of LeBron's gray sweatshirt before settling on his face. "Is this your truck?" "It is," LeBron said. "The registration is in the center console, my driver's license is in my front left pocket, and I am happy to produce both of them for you if you allow me to reach for them slowly. Keep your right hand exactly where it is, and use your left hand to pull the wallet out," Hobbs commanded, his body language tightening as he watched the massive frame of the man in front of him. LeBron moved with the agonizing slowness of a man who understood that every twitch of his muscle fiber was being evaluated by someone looking for a reason to justify a physical intervention. He produced a worn, black leather wallet, extracted his state driver's license, and handed it across the short distance separating them before leaning carefully into the truck cabin to retrieve the current registration papers. Both documents were entirely valid, issued under the legal name of LeBron Raymond James, matching the identification numbers of the blue Ford Expedition in black and white ink. Hobbs stared at the plastic card for several seconds, his brow furrowing as he looked at the name, then at the photo, and then up at the giant standing under the shadow of the live oaks. "Officer, I am the executive director of this entire establishment," Julian Sterling interrupted, stepping up to Hobbs's elbow with a smooth, professional helpfulness that signaled his absolute confidence in the system. "I have managed this property for 9 years, and I can state with absolute certainty that this individual is not a member here, and a vehicle of that classification does not belong to anyone with a legitimate reason to be in this circle." Anyone with a legitimate reason. The words hung in the humid air, like a physical mist between the trees. Officer Miller's eyes flicked to her supervisor and then back to the crowd on the veranda, her jaw tightening as she noted the phrasing. But she remained silent because seniority held the radio. Hobbs did not return the driver's license to LeBron. Instead, he slid the registration papers into his clipboard and took half a step back. "You're going to need to remain exactly where you are while I run these codes through the state database to ensure everything is clear," Hobbs said. "My identification is completely clean, officer, and the registration matches the vehicle identification number on the dashboard," LeBron said, his voice remaining low, steady, and entirely flat. "There is nothing left to investigate here. A complaint was filed by the property authority, and I am following standard department procedure until I am satisfied," Hobbs said, turning his back and walking toward his cruiser with LeBron's livelihood still held in his right hand. And with that single administrative movement, the trap closed. LeBron James was now, for all practical purposes of the law, detained in a public clearing against his will without a charge, a crime, or a single broken statute. A man cannot legally drive away from an estate without his driver's license, and Hobbs understood that the administrative possession of the card was more effective than a pair of steel handcuffs. This was the quiet, terrifying machinery of institutional authority, a process that looks entirely reasonable from the outside because it wraps itself in the language of procedure while serving the pride of the gatekeeper. Down at the lower edge of the property, near the gravel path that led to the maintenance sheds, Elijah Vance set his grease rag down on a wooden workbench, his knuckles turning a hard ash-gray color as he watched the red and blue lights pulse against the trees. He knew the absolute reality of what was happening up that hill, not as a guess or a theoretical social concept, but as a map he had been forced to navigate every single day of his 67 years in the county. He knew with the perfect clarity of an old man who remembered the names of his ancestors that the giant standing in that driveway owned the very soil the police cars were parked on. But he also knew, with a heavy, cold arithmetic, what it would cost a 67-year-old groundkeeper with a bad knee and a young granddaughter to raise to walk up that limestone slope and openly contradict a white executive and a white police supervisor in front of 40 wealthy club members. He had been written up by Julian Sterling just 2 months prior for what the director had labeled an unacceptable tone after Elijah politely informed a corporate board member that they could not leave their golf cart idling in the emergency access lane. 34 years of perfect service. 34 years of yes, sir, and right away and immaculate turf had been balanced against one single instance of being correct, and the corporate file had recorded it as a blemish. He knew what speaking up would cost him if Julian decided he was being difficult. His pension, the local health insurance policy that covered his medication, and the dental funds for his granddaughter's braces that the local clinic had just approved. All of it could vanish in an afternoon if the wrong person decided that Elijah Vance no longer fit the culture of whispering pines. But as he looked up the hill at the tall man standing with his empty hands exposed under the sun, Elijah also calculated the other side of the ledger, the invisible cost that never appears on a bank statement but sits in Anne's throat for the rest of his life. He had stayed silent before in his youth, more times than he cared to remember, and each time he had surrendered a small piece of his humanity that he could never trade back from the dark. He wiped his calloused palms on his trousers, straightened his spine despite the sharp ache in his left knee, and began the long walk up the gravel slope toward the flashing lights. While Elijah Vance climbed the slope, Officer Hobbs came back from his cruiser, LeBron's documents still held firmly in his right hand. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of LeBron, an aggressive, deliberate closeness designed to force a massive man to look down and acknowledge his authority. "Going to need you to open up the rear of the vehicle, pop the trunk, and let me take a look inside." "No," LeBron said. The word landed flat and quiet in the space between them, dropping like a stone into water. Hobbs's jaw moved, his teeth grinding together under his tanned skin, because he was not a man who heard that word often from someone he had already categorized as a suspect. "You got nothing to hide here, sir. So why not just open it up and speed this process along?" "Because you don't have a warrant," Officer LeBron said, "and you don't have probable cause to initiate a search of my private property. I've shown you a valid driver's license and a matching registration that proves ownership of this vehicle. I am declining the search, which is my explicit right under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, and I am going to exercise it right now." He said it without a hint of heat, without challenge, just a plain, cold statement of the law by a man who knew it by heart. And that, more than anything else that had happened in the driveway, seemed to bother Hobbs, who was entirely used to the law being a tool he administered rather than a shield that could be quoted back at him by a man in a worn sweatshirt. "I'm trying to help you out here, buddy," Hobbs said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "No, officer, you're trying to search my truck without legal authority, and I'm telling you, politely, no," LeBron replied. Hobbs stared at him for 5 long seconds, his fingers twitching near his belt. Then he turned away, keyed his shoulder microphone, and LeBron heard the words go out over the static, calm, and devastating. "Requesting a K-9 unit to my location, possible vehicle theft. Subject is being uncooperative. Subject uncooperative." LeBron had handed over every requested document, answered every question directly, and never once elevated his voice or shifted his stance. But he had said no to an unlawful search, and in the specific grammar of that gravel driveway, knowing your constitutional rights had just been converted into evidence of criminal guilt against you. The dispatcher's voice cracked back through the radio, informing Hobbs that the nearest K-9 handler was 20 minutes away, which meant the man who secretly owned the club, the lot, and the earth beneath their boots was going to stand there for another 20 minutes under the sun, while 40 people filmed him for a crime that had never occurred. "While we wait for the unit to arrive," Hobbs said, turning back around and pointing a thick finger toward the concrete edge of the parking island, "I'm going to need you to go ahead and have a seat on the curb." The curb. As though LeBron were a truant teenager caught lifting candy from a gas station, as though the lip of concrete at the edge of a parking lot were the natural-like designated place for a man like the one Hobbs had decided he was. LeBron looked down at the concrete, then back up into Hobbs's eyes. "I'll stand." "I said have a seat," Hobbs repeated, taking a step closer until his chest was nearly touching LeBron's. "And I said I'll stand," LeBron said, his voice not rising even a half step, remaining perfectly balanced and firm. "I haven't been charged with a crime. I'm not under arrest, and you've already confirmed my license and registration are valid. I'll wait here because you've taken my identification and asked me to, but I will wait on my feet." The moment stretched out until the air felt brittle. On the veranda, you could have heard a glass set down against a table. The flag on the clubhouse pole snapped once in the breeze and went completely still. It was Officer Miller who broke the tension, stepping in with an easy professional movement that angled her body between the two men without seeming to force her way through. "Let's just wait for the K-9 unit to clear. Gary, he's not going anywhere," she said lightly, putting herself there on purpose. Hobbs stepped back half a step, his eyes staying locked on LeBron the way a guard dog watches a fence line. That was when Elijah Vance reached the top of the slope, his breathing heavy from the climb. He did not go to Hobbs. He had lived long enough to know better than to bring a contradiction to an angry man with a badge. He went to the younger woman, to Officer Miller, holding out the digital tablet he used for the country club's maintenance logs. His voice steady, even though his hands were shaking against the plastic case. "Officer, ma'am, you've got this whole thing wrong. That's Mr. James. I've worked these grounds for over 30 years, and I'm telling you that's his vehicle. He belongs here. He belongs here more than just about anybody." Miller looked down at the tablet, seeing the maintenance records and the older man's employee identification. She took the tablet over to her supervisor, showing him the screen. Hobbs glanced at it for less than 2 seconds before waving his hand dismissively. "Could be a vehicle he's driving for someone else. It doesn't prove he owns the gear on the back. We wait for the unit." And that was it. 34 years of knowing every square inch of the property dismissed in 2 seconds because it didn't fit the story they wanted to believe. Elijah stood there with the tablet in his shaking hands, looking across the driveway at LeBron. And LeBron looked back at him. And LeBron did a small thing then, a gesture that cost nothing, but meant everything to the old man. He gave Elijah Vance one slow, deliberate nod. It was not a thank you for fixing the problem, because Elijah hadn't been able to fix it. It was something better. It said, "I saw what you just did. I know exactly what it cost you to walk up this hill, and I will not forget it." Julian Sterling, seeing the interaction, drifted back over to the officers to add more fuel to the fire he had started. "Officer Hobbs, I think it's important to note that before he went to the back of the truck, I saw him moving between several other member vehicles, looking through the windows. I believe he was casing the entire lot for targets. It was a complete lie, whole and clean. LeBron had walked in a straight line from the clubhouse door directly to his rear rack. And when I first confronted him," Julian continued, "he became immediately aggressive and told me I deeply regret it if I didn't step back." LeBron watched the executive's mouth move, watching the system do precisely what it was built to do. He watched a lie become an official line in a police report because the person telling it looked like he belonged there, and the person it was told about did not. His large jaw tightened, his free hand closing once into a tight fist inside his pocket and then opening back up. He breathed 4 counts in, 4 counts out, keeping his other hand visible on the handlebars, refusing to give them the reaction they needed to justify what they wanted to do next. He reached into his sweatshirt pocket, pulled out his phone, and made one single call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Langston, it's me," LeBron said, his voice a low, heavy murmur. "I'm down at the Whispering Pines estate in Savannah. I need you to get down here right now, and I need you to bring the Summit Ridge Capital acquisition file. Bring the original corporate bylaws, the employment covenants, and the full asset organization chart. All of it." There was a sudden, sharp pause on the other line as Langston Cole, LeBron's primary corporate counsel and longtime advisor, read the exact temperature of his friend's voice. "How bad is the situation?" "Bad enough," LeBron said, looking at the red and blue lights reflecting off his truck's windshield. "There are 2 units here, they've taken my license, and they've just called for a K-9 team." "I'm 20 minutes out from that area," Langston said. "Make it 15. LeBron replied, and then he slid the phone back into his pocket. Across the gravel circle, Julian Sterling was leaning against the stone pillar of the valet stand with two of his wealthy friends, completely relaxed now, even laughing as they shared a comment. It was the posture of a man who believed the hard part of his day was over, and the outcome had already been decided in his favor. LeBron watched him from under the shadow of his hood, and what was written on the giant's face was not anger, and it was not a desire for revenge. It was something much closer to a deep, patient sorrow, the particular sadness of a man who can see exactly how much the next hour is going to cost a person who still thinks they are winning. Langston Cole made it to the property in 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes were their own small eternity as the K-9 unit remained stuck behind a minor traffic accident down the main highway, leaving the gravel driveway frozen in a state of suspended animation. The parking circle held 40 silent onlookers, 2 police officers, 1 executive director, and 1 tall man standing beside a bicycle. LeBron did not check his phone, he did not pace the length of his truck, and he did not break his silence. He simply stood there with the patience of a man who had already looked at the final page of the script and was waiting for the rest of the actors to catch up to his position. Julian Sterling's absolute certainty had begun, somewhere during those long minutes, to develop hairline fractures. He had expected the man in the gray hoodie to be handcuffed and hauled away by now, the unpleasant disruption resolved, and the proper social order of the club immediately restored. Instead, the giant simply stood by the blue Ford Expedition, completely unbothered, his dark eyes steady under the shadow of his hood. His absolute calm was beginning to frighten Julian in a way the director could not logically explain to his friends. Guilty men did not wait with that kind of physical stillness. They became defensive, they got loud, or they attempted to look for an exit. A sleek black American sedan rolled through the iron gates of Whispering Pines, moving at a controlled, unhurried pace before coming to a stop near the police cruisers. A man stepped out who did not match the humid southern morning at all, wearing a charcoal gray tailored suit with a leather portfolio held securely under his left arm. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and walked across the gravel driveway at a rhythm that suggested he had never once in his career arrived anywhere late or flustered. Langston Cole had managed corporate movements for decades, building a reputation out of walking into rooms exactly like this one and completely shifting the gravity of the room using nothing but paper. He did not believe in raising his voice. He believed in the slow, devastating power of an undeniable fact laid flat on a table where everyone was forced to look at it. Julian noticed him first, the easy smile on his face faltering as the attorney approached the perimeter. He did not know the man's identity, but he recognized the cut of the suit, the expensive leather portfolio, and the absolute authority of the walk, the way an animal senses a shift in the local weather. Langston walked straight past Julian without a single glance, stepping directly into the space between Officer Hobbs and the blue truck. "Officer Hobbs, my name is Langston Cole, and I am the primary legal counsel representing the gentleman you have been detaining in this driveway," he said, his voice smooth, clear, and perfectly projected. He did not wait for the officer to respond to his introduction. He set his leather portfolio down on the warm metal hood of the police cruiser, unzipped the zipper, and began to lay out legal documents, one by one like a dealer handling cards in a game he had already won before the first turn. The first document was the official state title to the navy blue Ford Expedition, registered under the name LeBron Raymond James, with a clear title and no liens. The second document was the active incorporation filing for Summit Ridge Capital, listing LeBron James as the founder and majority shareholder of the investment fund. The third document was the finalized asset acquisition agreement dated 24 months prior, detailing the exact financial terms by which Summit Ridge Capital purchased the Whispering Pines Golf and Country Club out of total insolvency to save it from bankruptcy. The fourth document was the current organizational hierarchy chart of the hospitality group running the daily operations of the estate. Langston placed his index finger on a specific column near the bottom of the page, holding it there for several seconds so Hobbs could read the text clearly. Julian Sterling, Executive Director, an employee of the management subsidiary, wholly owned and financed by Summit Ridge Capital. Langston straightened his spine, turned his body away from the cruiser, and elevated his voice for the first time all morning, pitching it so that it carried across the driveway, up to the terrace railing, and directly into the teenagers' recording phones. "Let me make this entry completely clear for the record, officer," Langston said. "My client is not stealing a bicycle or a vehicle from this property. My client owns this property, and the executive director who called the emergency services to have him removed from his own land." He turned his torso and looked directly into Julian Sterling's eyes. "Works for him." The silence that followed those words was not the ordinary, awkward quiet of a social misunderstanding. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that arrives when the ground shifts beneath everyone's feet at the exact same fraction of a second. 40 wealthy members understood simultaneously that they had just witnessed an administrative execution that they would never be able to unwatch for the rest of their lives. Julian Sterling's face did not lose its color gradually. It went entirely pale all at once, the light vanishing from behind his eyes as his mouth fell open without a single sound coming out of it. The arithmetic was running behind his eyes now, the same human math he had refused to perform an hour ago, when it could have preserved his career. The man in the gray sweatshirt owned the fund. The fund paid his salary, and he had just spent 20 minutes trying to have his own employer arrested because of the texture of his clothes. He took 2 stumbling steps toward LeBron, his open palms rising in a frantic, desperate gesture of appeal, reaching for a social railing that was no longer there to support him. "Mr. James, please, if I had known who you were, this entire situation would have been handled with the utmost discretion," he stammered, his voice thin, reedy, and stripped of all its previous executive authority. "This is all just a terrible, unfortunate misunderstanding. I was only trying to protect the safety and standards of our community." And there it was, the absolute core of the sickness, exposed in the span of 2 short sentences. Not an apology for the tarnish he had tried to place on a human being, not an admission that he was fundamentally wrong to treat a man like a criminal based on his skin and his hoodie, but a defense based on his own ignorance. How could I have known? As if the actual crime was his failure to recognize celebrity, rather than the casual cruelty he would have successfully inflicted on a regular person who didn't have a billionaire's ledger to protect them. He was, even as his professional life collapsed into the gravel, attempting to remain the diligent hero of his own internal narrative. LeBron raised his right hand, palm flat, the universal sign for a complete stop. He did not yell, he did not step into the director's personal space, and his voice did not rise a single decibel from the quiet register he had maintained all morning. "You didn't know who I was," LeBron said, his words falling like iron weights on the driveway. "That's true, but that isn't the part that matters to me, Mr. Sterling. You didn't call the police because of my name. You called them because of who you decided I was before I ever opened my mouth to speak to you." He took half a step closer, his massive shadow completely engulfing the director. "And if I had been the man you thought I was, a regular man with a scratched bike, an old truck, and no corporate lawyer to call to this driveway, everything you did today would have worked perfectly. That is the part you need to think about while you pack your office. You aren't sorry that you treated a human being like garbage. You're only sorry that you accidentally did it to someone who has the power to fire you for it. We'll be in touch through legal channels. Julian Sterling stood frozen as LeBron turned back to his truck. He did not just lose his job that morning. He had been forced to look into a mirror that stripped away his illusion of righteousness, leaving him to face the ugly reality of his own prejudice in front of the very people whose respect he had spent his entire life trying to buy. Time passed, and the heavy humidity of that summer morning gradually gave way to the crisp, sharp air of late autumn, turning the leaves of the great live oaks from deep emerald to a brittle burnt bronze. The viral video filmed by the member's daughter had circled the internet within 48 hours. And for a few intense weeks, the small suburb of Savannah became the focal point of a massive national conversation about dignity and institutional bias. But LeBron James did not use the public outrage to fuel a media campaign or stage a triumphant press conference. He quietly directed his team at Summit Ridge Capital to execute a total structural overhaul from the inside out. The old corporate bylaws of the Whispering Pines Golf and Country Club were permanently amended to include strict, legally binding worker protections that stripped the front office executives of any power to arbitrarily terminate or discipline the operational staff. Julian Sterling did not simply disappear into the background after his termination. The loss of his position forced him into a prolonged, isolating isolation that shattered his long-held social standing in the city. He faced an official charge for filing a false police report, resulting in a year of supervised probation, a significant financial fine, and 80 hours of mandatory community service at a local youth development center in downtown Savannah. It was during those long hours, spent cleaning floors and organizing equipment for young kids who looked exactly like the billionaire he had tried to humiliate, that the first genuine cracks formed in his old worldview. In a private letter sent to Langston Cole's office months later, Julian did not offer a polished corporate excuse or ask for his old life back. He wrote a sparse, painful admission that he had finally understood how his own unexamined certainty had turned him into a cruel man. The institutional fallout reached the local precinct as well, where an internal affairs investigation evaluated the full body camera footage recorded during the encounter. Officer Garrett Hobbs was stripped of his field supervisor status and placed on a 4-month unpaid administrative suspension before being reassigned to a stationary desk duty at the county records department, far away from the active street patrols. Officer Rachel Miller's written report, which documented her repeated, ignored recommendations to release LeBron at the scene, earned her a quiet respect among the younger ranks and accelerated her promotion to a training coordinator position within the department. The systemic machinery that usually protected veterans like Hobbs had been forced to bend because the man standing in the driveway possessed the resources to ensure the truth could not be buried under a stack of official paperwork. The structural changes at the country club brought a profound, lasting peace to the maintenance sheds and kitchen quarters where the actual life of the property was sustained. Lodge was officially appointed as the estate's general harbor and ground master, a newly created leadership position that came with a private office, a comprehensive health care package, and a salary that permanently secured his granddaughter, Maya's, educational future. He no longer had to navigate the limestone slopes with an anxious heart or calculate the terrifying cost of speaking the truth to an arrogant superior. His 34 years of quiet dedication were finally anchored in an institutional standing that guaranteed he would never again have to risk his livelihood to be treated with basic human decency. The morning arrived at Whispering Pines 3 months later, bringing with it a deep, unforced stillness that settled over the wide bends of the Savannah River before the first golf carts could disrupt the turf. The slate-gray water gradually softened into a brilliant, reflective silver as the early autumn sun cleared the eastern line of pines, warming the damp timber of the lower docks. The dusty blue Ford Expedition was parked in a regular, unassigned stall at the far edge of the employee lot. Its rear rack carrying the weathered mountain bike with its chipped metal frame exposed to the clean light. LeBron James sat alone on a green wooden bench near the water's edge, a cardboard cup of gas station coffee resting between his large palms. As he watched the mist rise off the riverbank, Elijah Vance came out of the main tool shed below, carrying a clipboard out of 30 years of unbroken habit rather than necessity, his gait smooth and slow in the morning air. He looked up toward the limestone path, caught sight of the giant in the gray sweatshirt, and lifted his right hand in a simple, quiet wave that required no words to convey its meaning. LeBron lifted his cardboard cup in return, his face relaxing into a calm, steady smile, because both men had lived long enough to understand that the most important truths in this life do not require a loud voice to be felt. They sat in the shared quiet of the morning, watching the silver water turn into a hard, bright blue as the sun climbed higher into the sky. A young woman came out of the back door of the clubhouse, a newly hired kitchen assistant who had moved to the area only 2 weeks prior, carrying a heavy tray of clean porcelain cups to set up the veranda for the morning service. She did not recognize the massive frame of the man sitting on the bench, and if she had seen his face on a billboard or a television screen in the city, she did not connect it to the quiet figure drinking cheap coffee in the early light. She stopped near the edge of the path, wiped her brow with the back of her apron, and called out with a friendly, unprompted warmth that broke the silence of the grass. "Morning, sir. The real coffee pots are just finishing brewing inside, if you want me to bring you out a fresh mug." LeBron turned his head slowly, his dark eyes softening as he lifted his cardboard cup to acknowledge her gesture. "I'm all right, sister, but thank you for looking out," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. She nodded with an easy, unbothered smile and went back to organizing her tables under the porch, entirely unaware that her casual politeness carried the weight of a final verdict. She would never know that a billionaire had driven across 3 states and put on his oldest clothes specifically to find out if this ground could offer that exact piece of grace to a stranger who looked like absolutely nobody. And that small, unforced interaction, more than the legal documents on the cruiser's hood or the look on Julian Sterling's face when the platform crumbled beneath his feet, was the only thing he had actually come to find. I keep coming back to the open hands. Not the corporate deeds, not the attorney's portfolio, not the sudden shock that paralyzed the members on the veranda as the morning broke. The hands. LeBron kept his large palms exposed and resting loosely on the rubrics of a trips of his second the coal bars, through never closing of the confrontations, into a fist, because he knew that a closed fist would be read as an imminent threat by the men with the badges, and an open hand would not. He had learned that survival distinction the hard way, growing up on concrete streets, where a single misunderstood motion could cost a young man his entire life before he ever had a chance to speak his name. He stood on property that his own fund financed, holding the keys to his own truck, and he chose to maintain an open palm so that the people who held the authority would have no weapon to point to. That is the detail that refuses to leave my mind. We want to believe this is a triumphant story about a wealthy athlete who used his resources to crush an arrogant executive, and in a simple way it is, but that is the least instructive part of the ledger. The individual who stays with me is Elijah Vance, who walked up that limestone hill with a bad knee and no legal documentation, no high-priced corporate counsel, and no billionaire's fund attached to his name. LeBron James possessed a massive financial machinery to prove he was telling the truth to the police supervisor. Elijah Vance only possessed the truth itself, and the willingness to risk his livelihood to stand beside a stranger who needed a witness. And the immense, terrifying distance between simply having the truth and having the systemic power to prove it to a man with a badge is the entire distance this story is actually about. Most people live out their whole lives on the Elijah side of that clearing, and that is the reality we have to change.